Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the People and Processes Maintenance and Reliability Best Practices online training. Our title of today's webinar is Who's in Charge Around Here? Responsibilities for Planning and Scheduling. And our speaker is Jeff Shiver. Jeff Shiver guides people and organizations to success in reliability best practices. Working together in partnership, we move beyond the status quo in culture, business results, and most importantly, people. Jeff has over 25 years of practitioner experience. Within Mars North America, he worked at 4 plant locations and held 2 corporate roles. Job functions included engineering, maintenance, and operations management. Before Mars, he held contract engineering positions at Procter & Gamble and IBM. Founding People and Processes Incorporated in 2006, Jeff is a trusted advisor for the maintenance and reliability community. He is a conference speaker, thought leader, published in domestic and international trade journals, and co-author of Kidding in Maintenance. He is also the Membership Services Director for the Society of Maintenance and Reliability Professionals. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thanks, everybody, for taking the time to join us today. The goal is obviously to share lots of things with you with regard to maintenance roles and responsibilities, and of course, add value. So let's get started. So if we talk first about our mission, it's really simple. We're here to serve you. And our goal is to inspire you to become awesome in the maintenance and reliability best practices. That's our goal. If you're successful, then we're successful. It's pretty straightforward. So I wanted to share kind of a big picture with you and starting this out. So as part of that, if you look in the green section or the upper left, what you have is basically, how do we define our PM program? Preventive maintenance, predictive maintenance, time-based maintenance, and so forth. And out of that, we come out with proactive maintenance task procedures. We put those into SAP, Maximo, whatever system you have, and we trigger them out. Hopefully we workload level them so that we don't have them all coming out at the first of the month or the first of the week. They're balanced across the labor availability. And then we schedule those. We drop down into the work execution management portion. We schedule those, we coordinate, we execute the work. We provide feedback to planning, and I'll make a note here too as part of this. A lot of times, many of you don't have a good feedback loop coming back into the planners. And it's not just what was done from what do we need to do from a corrective standpoint, but also what is it that we need to do to improve the job plan. Remember, the purpose of a job plan is to make it where they're reusable. So we do maintenance work on this pump today. 2 years from now, we'll be back and we'll do work again. So how do we improve the job plan? That's the feedback loop coming back. Then we plan, any kind of corrective items. We ideally have job plans. We get the materials and we schedule it and we have a loop. And over on the bottom left, when we have a failure, we should have some type of a root cause process, 5 whys, 8-step, whatever you want to say, and that should feed you back into the reliability centered maintenance or PM optimization or FMEA process, and that process itself should be living anyway. So meaning that every 18 months you should be going back looking at your failure modes and effects analysis or RCM analysis, or go back and trying to say, okay, what do we need to do to optimize these PMs based on frequency or task? So one of the biggest misconceptions that I see is this expectation from the technicians that the planner scheduler is going to give them a perfect plan. At the same time, there's an expectation from the planner scheduler that they're going to get help in putting together a plan. And so you can see right there that there's a mismatch. And if we think about what planning and scheduling is all about, it's about eliminating the avoidable delays, things like waiting on materials, waiting on the equipment to come available, waiting for information or trying to search for information and losing time doing that. And so the goal is really to give a jump start. We don't necessarily have to have a perfect plan if we can have that feedback loop coming back from the field technicians into the planner so that we can update the job plan and improve it every time that we send it out. Remember, give them a head start. That's really the goal. So when we talk about roles and responsibilities with regard to planner schedulers, maintenance supervisors, and really everybody in the organization, we really need to identify what our process looks like. And, this is a very high level process that you see here, and we're not going to spend a lot of time with it. The point is that you need to have established these processes. And in many cases, I find organizations that have failed to do this, or they simply have not, they're not available, they're not readily available. We don't train people on them. And so what happens is that at that point, they're not common knowledge to the organization. And this is where we start to get into duplication of activities. For example, I might find that the planner can spend all day looking for a particular part, can spend tons of time trying to go and get a quote, for example, on a particular part. And then it goes over to the buyer, maybe in the stockroom, and that individual looks at it and says, I'm going to go over here. I've got these handshake agreements with this person, this group over here. I'm going to get a price from them, and they end up getting the item from that individual, and yet the planner spent all this time doing it. So it's a perfect example of how we really need to be clear with regard to the roles and responsibilities, and establishing the business processes up on the very front end help us establish that. And then we have what's called a RACI or a RACI: responsibility, accountability, consult or support, and then information. And if we think about the RACI, responsibility is the doer. Who actually is responsible to execute this? The A is accountability. The buck has to stop somewhere. And typically for any given task, you typically only find one person, except with very, very rare exceptions where you have two. You only typically have one person who's ultimately accountable for the execution of that task. And then consult or support, hey, let me talk to the technician about this, or let me talk to the maintenance supervisor, or maybe I need to talk to an engineer. And so for any given task, that may be who I consult. And if you think about this, you might need to pull different people in as part of it. And the tasks themselves, they come from the business process. And then if you look at the I is for information, keep me in the loop. And so, hey, just to let you know, Mr. or Mrs. Maintenance Manager, this is going on, or maybe the plant manager needs to be in the loop, or the operations manager. So this is how we define that. And at the end of the day, this is the output, a job description. Here's the roles and responsibilities that we expect for this particular position. So this is how we get to that, but let's talk a little bit more about aligning the organization for proactive planning and scheduling. And there are a lot of roles. There's the maintenance management side. There's the maintenance and reliability engineering side. There's obviously the planning scheduler. There's the first line supervision. And when I talk about supervision in this presentation, that's exactly what I'm talking about. First line supervision that's a level above the technician, the person who's actually hopefully in the field the bulk of their time, managing and leading the work activities. And you may also have a CMMS administrator, you may have business analysts that are all part of that. But in this presentation, we're simply going to focus on the work execution management portion of that. And we're going to start with the stockroom. And so from a stockroom standpoint, you may have somebody in the stockroom who actually buys your materials, or you may have somebody who's not necessarily in the stockroom, but a procurement person, procurement agent or buyer who maybe sits in the front office, or maybe in the corporate role, may be located in the central location. But this is the person or people that are responsible for purchasing for the storeroom activities. And I'll make the comment too, that it's really important that we think about buying things through the stockroom. And the reason is because if we don't, then we can't track usage. If we're using P cards as an example, and those don't get to, P cards being purchasing cards, if those don't get to the work order, then we really can't track cost. And we don't have the ability, if we just get a lump sum bill at the end of the month, here's $30,000 that was spent, we never tend to go back and put that on the work order itself. And so it's really important, if we can buy things through the stockroom, then we can actually track usage. We get SKU numbers for it, even though they may be non-stock. And with regard to the stockroom, you also have the layout and organization. The stockroom should always be breathing, expanding, and contracting. Somebody has to do the ordering and the receiving, the transaction when they come in. And we have to maintain the inventory levels and do cycle counting. And there's a key piece here that I find very mixed results with across organizations throughout the world, and it's the staging and kitting. Ideally, if you think about this, this is a function that we would prefer the stockroom do. And the reason is they're the ones that handle the materials, they're the ones that purchase the materials, they receive the materials. So wouldn't it be great, can you imagine if you had a space in the stockroom, because the stockroom's already secure, where you're staging and kitting those, and as those parts come in, they get put into a kit. Those kits, once they're finished, you have a pick list inside the kit, and you highlight across the pick list. Once the items are there, you change the status to schedule ready. And in some cases, some organizations, the stockroom people actually deliver the kits out in advance of the schedule. So that brings us to a poll. When we talk about staging and kitting, I'd like to understand how do you do that within your organization? Kim, if you can, would you launch that for us?
Mm-hmm. Give you a minute or two to vote on it. Ten more seconds. Get your answers in. All right. And here was our responses.
Okay, so we had 19% that said yes, 43% said that the planner scheduler does the staging and kitting, and 38% says that we don't stage and kit materials. And that's a huge opportunity for us. And what it says is in many cases, we really don't have a good partnership between the storeroom and maintenance or planning and scheduling in particular. There may be some other reasons, but as a rule, that's what it says from my experience. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the operation side of planning and scheduling. And there's a role that I call the operations gatekeeper. And you typically find it a lot of times in chemical plants where you have business units set up. So you'll have a chemical plant that has multiple processes, and one business unit has responsibility for this particular process. And a lot of the chemical plants, what they do is they actually they control the maintenance budget, meaning that they basically pay maintenance for services rendered. So if you put in a PM comes due, then they pay so much per hour for that. Or, for an emergency work, they pay a much higher rate, as an example, to encourage proactive work. But what this person is somebody who basically is working with maintenance to help them understand, okay, from an operations standpoint, these are our priorities. This is what we need to focus on. And then at the same time, they're working with production planning to make sure that we get access to the equipment so that we can maintain it. And also, even in the weekly schedule, they work with the supervisor who has the responsibility for the current week, looking at that and saying, okay, how do we're running this line right now. We hope we'll be finished, but we're going to take this line down early. So they're bringing those kind of insights in to the maintenance schedule. And the whole goal is so we can eliminate surprises. How many times do you go out there and you're supposed to have access to a particular piece of equipment, some asset at 7 o'clock in the morning, and you get out there and you have to wait, and they're still running production, and they say, hey, come back at 3. Well, I get off at 3:30, so it doesn't really work out well. So we're trying to eliminate that. And then what we do too is, from the standpoint, this is an individual who looks at some of the operations requests and says, yeah, those make sense. So it's kind of an approver role as well, even though that may roll up to an operations supervisor based on how you set up your workflows within your CMMS, Computerized Maintenance Management System. And then as part of that too, what we're doing is we're looking and saying, okay, with regard to an agreed priority matrix, And what we should have is one centralized, one standardized priority matrix. So 1 is an emergency, 2 is urgent, 3 becomes PMs, for example. 4 is the first level of category, if you will, of plan work. 5 might be the next category, lower priority, and 6 might be the category after that. So you notice I just said that there were 3 separate categories for plan work. And there's some reasons for that, but we won't really have time to address that in this session. So now let's talk about the supervision aspects. So the maintenance supervisor is responsible for the current week. If we think about this, planning and scheduling is supposed to be proactive, meaning that the maintenance supervisor is responsible for the success of this week. The planner scheduler is responsible for the success of next week and beyond. So there's this tactical focus for the supervisor and a strategic focus for the planner schedulers. And so tactical meaning that we handle today, this week. And so they're responsible for the execution of the schedule. And so if we put out, for example, 400 hours worth of work on the schedule, then that supervisor should be doing everything they can to try to make sure that that 400 hours worth of work gets accomplished in the current week. Otherwise, it's going to show up in the next week's schedule, in the following week, or whatever the case may be. And the challenge is they have to get out in the field. And you get what you inspect. You stay behind the desk, it's not necessarily a great thing. And so with regard to getting out there in the field, the goal is to remove obstacles. And I'll share a thought with you, and I heard somebody say it the other day, and it's, if for plan work, if a maintenance technician is having to go to the storeroom for something other than basic nuts and bolts, then there's a problem. Because see, we shouldn't have to do that if we plan the job correctly. And I realize, you may not be along the journey far enough to be able to do that, but that should be an end goal for you, is how do we eliminate the travel time and having that technician having to go to the stockroom? And this is actually one of the roles of the supervisor. You might pass by a job and you see that, they need particular things, so your goal would be to go and actually gather those parts for them, for example. Again, how do you remove the obstacles? Maybe it's a clearance or a permit form that needs to be completed or something like that, and you're trying to encourage them, by removing those obstacles. Again, you're the one who's, as a supervisor, they're responsible for the execution of the work. So how do we move that forward? And also responsible for the development of the workforce. Typically supervisors have great technical skills. That's what got them into the supervisory role. And so, and I'll share with you, as you go further up the ladder with regard to supervision, the technical skills become less important and the conceptual skills become more important. The human skills stay about the same. But when we talk about workforce development and training, we really need to be thinking about how, if I take any one of the technicians that are in the field, where are they at? And if you see them struggling with something, then it's an opportunity for you to work with them to say, okay, how do we actually put together a development plan to help them? And maybe it gives you an opportunity to think about toolbox training. Well, what's toolbox training? It's where we have somebody present maybe 20 minutes in the shop. Maybe it's something like a basic thing on how we do laser alignment, or maybe we're doing alignment of shivs and sprockets using, laser tools for that. There's lots of different things can happen. And what we do is we encourage the technicians to actually bring forth ideas so that they can share those. And maybe that technician is an expert in that area, subject matter expert, they can share that. So again, it doesn't cost the business a lot of money, but it's a way that we continuously train and we set expectations. And then we talked about this before with regard to the continuous improvement loop, that feedback loop coming back to the planner. The maintenance supervisor should actually be looking at the work that's being completed and saying, okay, well, if you put a description in, it was broke, it's fixed, well, that's useless to us. And while the planner scheduler is actually the guardian of the CMMS data, the maintenance supervisor has a lot of input into that. And we have to work with the technicians, and it may surprise you, but I go into organizations all over the world and they struggle with getting good data. it's not just about having a work order completed. It's about having the failure codes identified, putting good descriptions, making sure the parts are listed. And as we build that data up, then we can make great decisions based on engineering concepts that we don't have access to without the data. So it takes a lot of the variability out of it, if you will. So we talked about the supervisor controls job execution, and ideally they should be working with the planner to look at the job plan. Hey, you know, have you thought about this? Or making sure something's right, or if there needs to be some kind of coordination that was missed. And so we're trying to do that. And the same thing with regard to management of change. So we don't want any changes or modifications, especially in places where you might have safety or environmental risk. We might want to get somebody else to look at that. And so we have to think about how we manage change. And we talked about that supervisor having responsibility for execution of the schedule in the current week. Well, for example, you may look and say, well, I'm not getting these jobs done. Let me ask Fred and Sally to stay over. And, you know, hey, can you guys work this afternoon and finish this jobs up and get us ahead a little bit so we can get caught back up on the schedule? That's the kind of overtime assignments that I'm talking about. And the frontline supervisor should have the flexibility to do that, working with maintenance management. And also, that supervisor is the one who actually puts the names to the task. And let me share this with you too. I see this happen all the time. If you are one of the organizations that takes and assigns 30-day PMs in folders, and you give John, let's say, these 30-day PMs, and then you give, you know, Fred over here another set of 30-day PMs. Sometimes John might, for example, take vacation, and you still need to get these jobs done. So I'm not a fan of doing that. I look for, let's have a weekly schedule and let's say where we're at on the weekly schedule. So basically every day, I want that supervisor to have already identified those names. But then if that individual calls in sick that day, then they need the flexibility to say, okay, hey, Fred, I need you to knock these out for me because they're a higher priority. And so then what should be happening is that supervisor should be assigning the work by day in the morning meeting or whatever, you know, the start of the shift meeting, saying, hey, everybody, this is what I need you to do. And then they need to understand where they're at on the schedule, because if you wait till the end of the week, then it's too late to make corrections in many cases. You know, so every day you hand out work, every day you get back work, and you know the current status. That way you can effectively manage it to manage and complete the schedule to get that 400 hours worth of work done this week. And ensures quality. We talked about removing the obstacles. For longer jobs, like 8-hour jobs or something, we want the supervisor to go out in the field and at least visit those jobs twice a day, sometimes more. And how do we make sure that we're adhering to the company's safe work practices and good housekeeping? It's amazing when I go to some sites and you see, you know, there's cans laying on the floor, drink cans, you know, other stuff like this, and you're like, wow, really? You know, and so it's doing basic housekeeping as part of that. And then how do we get better? You know, one of the things, we always talk about these things we call an open door policy. And the reality is with open door policies, nobody ever comes a lot of times, or it's always the same ones. The challenge is you have to get in the field and you have to have relationships with people. And you can't do that if you're sitting at the desk. And as we told you, you know, the technician shouldn't be coming to the storeroom for plan work, for parts. We should have already found those. But also the planner shouldn't be the one who's shagging those parts in the current week. They can shag parts for next week and beyond. Remember, strategic, future focused, not this week. The supervisor shags those for this week. And then inspects, provide on-the-job training, observe skill shortfalls, address lost time between jobs. You know, we talked about adherence to company policy, delays, understanding cost with regard to what the costs are for the job. And we talk about having the next job ready for execution. You should always, as a supervisor, have the jobs in your back pocket, more or less, meaning that, hey, we can't do this job right now because production, something happened and they're not able to finish the run, and we're going to have to run a little bit longer. So hi, Fred, John, can you guys go and knock this other job out for me? And so you're constantly massaging the schedule because, again, you want to try to get that 400 hours worth of work done. And you should also know what's in the backlog that's ready to schedule that maybe it's not on the schedule. And from a planning and scheduling standpoint, what I like to do is I like to have a schedule. Here's this 400 hours worth of work for this week, but then underneath at the bottom of that schedule, not counted in that list of 400 hours or some of the higher priority work that we didn't have time to get to, but if we could pull it forward, we would want to do that. And so that's part of that as well. Always have that next job ready. And then whatever decisions are necessary to adhere to the schedule, we want to do that. And then when we're done, when the technician finishes up, did we do what we said we were going to do? Was it done the right way? Was the quality right? Did we get the feedback right? Coming back to the planner, or if in the case of emergency or urgent work, the planner typically doesn't see that. So did we make sure that we've got it documented well there too? And, actual time versus estimated. And there's lots of tools you can use for metrics to show you where you're at with regard to planning and scheduling. I mean, you can have literally 100 metrics if you wanted, but it's insane to try to do that. But, again, we want to see, how are we doing with regard to the planning piece? And this is why the feedback loop is so important. We don't want the planners to take a vested interest in the jobs. We want them to be planning next week and the week after that. And so the supervisors should be making sure that we give feedback. Hey, Mr. or Mrs. Planner, you estimated 4 hours for this, but once we got into the job, we realized it's 6 to 8 hours or whatever the number is. And so that way we can correct the job plan for the next time. That's what's really important. And then we want to make sure that the task steps are right. We're looking for things like precision maintenance steps. So gaps, fits, torques, clearances, belt tension, any other items, hey, you forgot about this gasket that we needed or this seal or whatever the case may be. So we want to update the job plan as part of that. And that's the role of the planner to update it, but you got to give them the information to make that happen. And then we want to make sure that any kind of excess parts, we return those back to the stockroom. And that comes back to the partnership concept too, because if you don't have a good partnership with the stockroom, in many cases, a lot of them won't let you do that because they say, well, we've already ordered the part again, it's on the way, but we really need to be able to do that. We need to be able to return it. Otherwise, it goes out and becomes what I call squirrel stores. You got the squirreled away in somebody's locker or toolbox or whatever the case, and the business's money's tied up and nobody knows where it's at, and we forget about it. For a maintenance supervisor, the span of control should be around 8 to 15 technicians as a rule of thumb. Obviously, in smaller organizations, it can be a lower number than that, but if you have multiple supervisors, we look for some ratio around 8 to 15. And let me share something with you regarding these numbers. As if you're in a more reactive, I'll call it less mature organization, meaning that you haven't got planning and scheduling really going well, your schedule compliance is not good, you're really reactive, then you're going to be closer to the 8 number. And then as you become much more proactive and you're further down the journey, then it becomes more like 15 technicians per supervisor. And so we talked about the desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world go by. And when I go into organizations, there's lots of reasons that supervisors can't get in the field. But as managers for those supervisors, our challenge is to figure out how to free them up because, value is really added in the field where the work physically occurs. And we need those supervisors out there, which brings us up to another poll, Kim.
Okay, there we go. Give you about a minute to respond to the poll. Give you 10 more seconds. Okay. And there's the responses.
Okay, so we had 28% of the supervisors spend 2/3 of the day in the field. That's fantastic. That's a recommended amount, at least 2/3 of the day. And 52% doing admin work, recording time. And I'll share with you, that's actually one of the struggles that we've had over the years, because as we've invested in tools like timekeeping systems like Chronos, and we've taken away the clerical forces trying to get lean, in a misuse of that word. Even when you implement a new CMMS, as an example, people come back and say, hey, we can save you all this money because we can get rid of all these clerical people. The problem is those clerical people are adding value. Somebody still is having to approve this time, and it takes a lot of time to do that. And that was actually the highest rating. And then, of course, meetings. We have lots and lots of meetings. And so as a supervisor, as a manager, the real challenge is how do we free those supervisors up to be in the field? And it's not something we can obviously fix in this presentation, but an awareness of where we spend our time is really important. Okay. So now let's get to the planner scheduler role. And it may surprise you to hear this, but for organizations that have dedicated planner schedulers, we often find that less than 10% are actually used properly, not utilized properly. And, they might be doing everything else that nobody wanted to do. As an example, I've seen them doing, going out and spending, hold on. Going out and spending time doing fire extinguisher checks, as an example. And then, what we find is that companies also don't use their work order system well. And what may drive that is simply a bad implementation of the CMMS. And you see that a lot of times where the equipment hierarchy is not done well. We don't have good status codes. We don't have status codes like awaiting planning, waiting materials, ready to schedule, that type thing, or, just overall a poor implementation. So we always talk about these things, and it seems like, organizations I go to, we seem to try the same things over and over again, and really it's the definition of insanity, and how do we get better? And I'll also share with you at the end a way to think about getting better. So ideally, when we talk about the planner scheduler role, it should be one of your best craftspeople. And the reason for that is that if they have those skills, then it makes it really easy for them to plan jobs and to get that technician a head start. If they don't have the skills, then they have to spend more time physically going out and working with the technicians, and we just lose a level of efficiency as part of that. Ideally, good computer skills, because they live in the CMMS. They're constantly generating work orders, they're triggering PMs, they're updating PMs, all those things. And often they work alone. So number one, they have to be organized and motivated as part of it. And I see this with some planner schedulers. They'll work, for example, on the weekend, and they'll work on their tools, and that's okay. But what should happen is that the maintenance planner scheduler should report ideally to the maintenance manager, not a supervisor. And what we don't want to happen is we don't want a situation where the supervisor says, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Planner Scheduler, you were our best welder. I needed this welded up. Go out here and weld this for me, because then we lose our forward focus, our focus for next week. And so it's really important that we don't fall into that trap to let that happen. Yep. Okay, so when we talk about the planner scheduler, the primary objectives are communications. They're the ones who are communicating back and forth, between the operations people, between the maintenance people, but again, it's all around future work. And short-range planning and scheduling. And let me share something with you about this too, because I see this happen as well. I don't look for the scheduler. Once we put out the scheduler, once we put out the schedule during the course for next week as an example, and it goes out maybe at Friday at noon, we've locked the schedule at that point. Anything that comes in after that, anything that happens in that current week regarding that schedule, that's managed by the maintenance supervisor, not the scheduler. And I see companies fall into that trap, that what they'll do is they'll use the scheduler, the planner scheduler oftentimes, and it's a single person. So they use that planner scheduler and they have them massage the schedule in and out every day. But that takes them away from that forward focus that we want next week and beyond. So remember, the supervisors this week, planner schedulers next week. And so longer, strategic planning analysis, what's in the backlog? And I always like to share this little tip, backlog should not have birthdays. If you're celebrating a birthday for backlog, shame on you, because odds are you're not going to do it anyway. So let's keep that thing, the backlog, clean. Keep it cleaned out. And then planners may be involved in shutdowns and turnarounds. Typically, what happens is if we have large shutdowns and turnarounds, say, a month, 2 to 3 months long, whatever the case may be, then it really should be a separate planner who does that, because you can't, it becomes very difficult to manage that with a single resource or sharing those resources between the normal weekly work versus shutdown work. And there's also some administrative responsibilities, typically things like metrics, reporting, other stuff. And the planner scheduler is really the partner liaison, meaning to engineering, to operations, to production planning for non-emergency work. If it's emergency work, it should belong to the supervisor. Now, I want to share something regarding that. I see some organizations where they have the planner come in 15 minutes early and maybe do some level of planning, for emergency work for that day. And while, yeah, that's great in concept, what often happens is the planner gets sucked into this week, today, doing that. And it's not that we don't want a quick plan, to help the supervisor and the technicians further things along, but if we're not careful, it's very easy to pull that planner into this week. And then they'll spend half a day looking for parts, trying to order things, stuff like that, and then you've lost your focus on the future. So that's a huge issue. If you can manage that, knock yourself out, but most companies can't. And they help establish the equipment hierarchy. You might have a CMMS admin person who does some of that, or a CMMS administrator. That's quite okay. Assistant development of the PM program. One of the things that I really encourage people to do with regard to their PM program is to look and say, okay, do I have a good foundational knowledge of how equipment fails? And if you don't, I really strongly suggest you consider something like our RCM2 intro class, which is 3 days. That way you can learn about how equipment fails. You can learn about, proactive tasks, how to select between them, how to determine frequencies, all that stuff. And it's a huge benefit for you. Even if you're not even doing RCM, you're doing, maybe PM optimization or simply adjusting frequencies. It's a huge benefit to learn that. And so anyway, ensures accuracy of bills of material. So as the planner's ordering things, they should be looking and saying, okay, is this linked, this item linked to what we're using it on? For example, we may have a pump, it may use a particular bearing, that bearing might be used on other components as well. Well, if we use it for that particular pump, and if the link's not there, we need to link it. That way we can understand later, when it comes time, if, for example, a part hasn't moved and it's a slow moving item, then we can go back and say, okay, well, where is it used? While it's really used across 6 different items within the plant. We need to understand that. And maintain the equipment history. They're the guardian of the data. So as work orders, plan work especially as it comes in, we want to make sure that we use keywords in the descriptions, the failure codes are properly identified, the right level in the parent-child relationship in the functional location, asset hierarchy. And then, of course, detailed job plans. And we're not going to talk about it in this presentation, but the level of detail is important. And you have to think about job plans can actually be used for emergency work. So we could have a server, for example, where we have those stored, and they're PDFs, and the technician, if we have an emergency and it's a complex job, they can print that out very quickly. Here's all the parts you need, everything else. So it's really important that we leverage those. Job plans cost money to make, but by the same token, they save a tremendous amount of time. 3 to 5 times, plan work's 3 to 5 times more effective than reactive, unplanned work. What kind of parts are necessary? And that comes back into the planning. Some items, as I said, sometimes we don't necessarily need detailed job plans, but if there's ever the opportunity to leverage that, we want to do that. And so what are the parts necessary? And sometimes I'll even give extra parts, meaning that, you know, I'm not sure if they'll need this particular gasket, but I'm going to include it, and then we'll turn it back in later. And the intent there is to be able to save them the travel time if they do need it. But again, you have to balance that. And what's a reasonable labor estimate? So you want to think about it from an analytical estimating standpoint. If I take this particular job, you know, maybe it's replacing a pump. How do I do that? What are the task steps? Well, I might need an electrician to come over and disconnect the motor. And, you know, then we've got to break the coupling, and we've got to do some other stuff. And so you eat this elephant one bite at a time. And so that's really analytical estimating. How much time for the electrician to, you know, unhook the motor, you know, to lock it out, tag it out, unhook the motor. Then, you know, they disappear. The mechanic deals with the rest of it, and then come back. You know, I need the electrician back for, you know, 30 minutes to hook back up the motor, or whatever the case may be. So as you're doing that, now that helps you when you think about coordination aspects as well. Because now, you know, okay, I've got to have the electrician, I've got to have maybe an operator potentially to help with the cleanliness. I might have a helper. I might, you know, all those coordination aspects is part of that as well. The necessary drawings, again, you know, what can we do to help that technician provide that information so they don't have to do it? We shouldn't, for example, say per specification in the job plan, because now we just sent that individual off looking for something. You know, we need to say, okay, if the torque's 80 foot-pounds, we need to put 80 foot-pounds in the job plan. Any kind of special tools, any kind of equipment downtime with operations, any kind of status as it moves through the CMMS, for example. Okay, well, we're still awaiting materials, and storeroom thinks that we're going to have that in the next 2 weeks. And so you keep them updated on that. And cost information. So, you know, hey, we've really spent a ton of money on this particular servo motor over here and this system, where we've got one that's similar over here, and we've not spent much money on it at all. Now, why? And so that helps us with driving our defect elimination, and understanding our failures. And then, you know, we talked about annual overhaul schedules. And what we want to do as well is schedule a full day's work, 100% of the available hours. And we can have separate discussions on that, but that's really the target, is 100% of the available hours. And that's for each day, not just the weekend. I see some companies, and they just put out a schedule just for the weekend, and during the course of the week, they say, well, we're running. But yeah, there's lots of work we can do, and that's the whole goal of planning and scheduling, is to help us maximize the available time. We're not asking the technicians to work harder. And many times it helps them pass the day if you've got things for them to do, rather than just stand around and twiddle their fingers and wait for equipment to break. That's not what this is about. We're trying to maximize the schedule and get as much work done as we can to make sure that we don't have the level of reactivity. And everything needs to be developed based on priority. And I talked earlier about, in the priority matrix, about having 3 levels of plan work. And so what you would do, for example, is you would have 60% of your available resources dedicated to the highest priority plan work, and maybe 25% to the next level priority plan work. And then down at the bottom, the 15% of the available resources dedicated to that, the third level of priority plan work. And the reason is, for example, this might be something that you assign to the reactive technicians if you've broken up your crew and such. This is work that they can break away from and come back to. But if we always focus on the highest priority work, and we never do anything with the low priority work, then what will happen is they turn back around, and the operator, whoever, says, well, I put it in, nobody did anything, so now I'll put it as a safety work order or something, so they know they'll get a response. And so we don't want things to drop into the black hole of maintenance. We want people to work on it, on all the different priorities. It's just at different rates. And of course, you know, as as you get close to the requested by date, the priority may increase as part of that too. So we want to make sure we've got a negotiated weekly schedule. We need a weekly scheduling meeting. Ideally, we want it as close to the end of the week as we can, assuming that your schedule starts on the following Sunday or Monday or whatever the case may be. And we talked about graphs and reporting. And we talked about reviewing and adjusting backlog work. We need to, between the supervisor and the planner and the production gatekeepers, if you will, what is it that's most important to us right now? Priorities change and shift, and we should make sure that we're not putting things on the schedule that we don't have parts for. So we need ready to status items, and that's what we're doing is we're building up a backlog. And when I talk about that, I see this happen too. I see organizations and they'll look and say, okay, well, we've got these work orders. On Tuesday, we're going to have a meeting and decide what we're going to plan to do next week. Okay, well, we may not even have the parts to do that work. But now we're deciding on Tuesday, the planner has to scramble to get the materials in. We overnight things, we expedite, we do all this stuff. And it's insane in some ways. And then we've got stuff on the schedule that the parts haven't even shown up yet. And so we can't get the work done. And so the schedule's always in a state of flux. And so we don't want to do that. We should only be pulling down things that are ready to schedule. The parts are here. We're only waiting on the resource physically to do the work and the line availability or equipment availability to make that happen. Everything else is ready. The job plan's done. The parts are here. We're ready. And we should agree on the schedule, any kind of outage. And this is a piece, I go to some organizations and I see where production planning is not involved with maintenance. They don't really have good communications. I'm like, well, why not? Why don't we have those conversations and say, okay, next week, the line's gonna be down this much. And if you're really proactive about it, what happens is many of the production planners, if you build a partnership with them, they will schedule specific days down for you. In other words, every 2 weeks, we're going to take a Thursday down to work on this line. Or maybe we're going to have 4 hours, or we can arrange, maybe you've got flavor changes or allergen changes or other things like that. You can work in opportunities to do maintenance work. And so you need to be considering those. So when we talk about this, and those are kind of the roles of the supervisor and the planner, I'll share something with you that I learned as a maintenance manager, continuous improvement manager. And what happened is we basically had the planners located downstairs, and there were a little office area, and in the front of the office area they had basically a calibration lab, and then for instrumentation. In the back they had computers, and where the maintenance technicians could come in and put their time in and close the work orders out and update those and document them. And what would happen is then, and it was also, you kind of went on the outside and you could go to the storeroom, the counter at the storeroom, and you could come up through doors, in both directions to get where the planners were at. And what would happen is the technicians would come through, and they would, rather than going around the corner, they would go through the planner office, and they would say, hey, John, how are things going? Blah, blah, blah. And it would interrupt the planner. And then what would happen too is that, hey, can you look up this part for me? And this is a part for a job in progress. And again, and all of a sudden we're taking the planner away from doing the things that they need to be doing for next week. We sucked them into this week. So the point here is we really want to think about where do we locate the planners, schedulers. And we ended up actually putting them on a mezzanine out of the traffic pattern. And it wasn't because we were trying to isolate them so they didn't have any conversations with anybody. We were just trying to prevent some of the disruptions that they were suffering from. So it's a piece to learn from with regard to that. And the planner scheduler should really spend a third of the day in the field, meaning that they're going out and they're walking down jobs and they're looking and saying, okay, what parts do I need? What kind of, what are some of the task steps? And when we talk about spans of control, again, 15 to 20 for less mature organizations with their planning process, 30 for the more mature individuals. And, sometimes it even gets to a higher number than that. Some chemical plants will have a ratio of 40 technicians, but they're very, very mature. They have tons and tons of job plans. Things are just recycled. They pull those job plans out. Everything's defined. It doesn't take the planners a lot of time. And so, that number may vary. but you may only have one planner scheduler, and typically you can justify a full-time role for a planner scheduler with about 8 to 10 technicians if you only have one. So you can go much lower. I'll share with you, you can actually justify a planner scheduler with 3 people if they're at like 35% wrench time. And many times you find around 25% wrench time. So you can actually get, if you take somebody take one of those technicians out of the 3, make them a planner scheduler, then you actually get more work done, even though it's not a full-time job for a planner scheduler. And then let's talk a little bit about split roles. And I see this in organizations, especially smaller organizations. What happens is they combine the role of the planner scheduler with the supervisor. I really strongly advise against that, and here's why. What happens is that when you do that, especially in a reactive organization, the supervisor's dealing with fighting the fires of today or this week, and then we lose all focus. The first thing thrown out the window is planning for next week and beyond. So it's really important not to fall in that trap. And I realize it may be beyond your control, but I would really encourage you to educate your management around that. And I realize in a small organization where you have less than 8, technicians in total, that's probably hard to do. I get it. But when you're in larger organizations, you really need to consider how you do that. Okay, Kim, that brings up the next poll, last poll for us today.
Okay. Give you a minute to answer. Ten seconds left. All right, and there's the responses.
Okay, so we've got 42% where the planner scheduler's roles are combined, and that's typically what you see at most organizations. And then in some larger organizations, you split the roles, and that's quite okay. Again, I want to share this, though, as part of the planning process. As the work comes in, the planner should plan that work, no matter whether they're combined or separate. They should plan it all the way through and get the materials in order, and then they go and continue to focus on the next job. You should be creating a backlog of planned work. You shouldn't sit out here and have a bunch of work that's sitting in the queue waiting to be planned. You should always plan everything through, and then you may wait on materials, and then, like say, the scheduling function then pulls it down. So they're really 2 different hats. And again, do everything from a planning standpoint, and as materials come in, then put it on the schedule, role of the scheduler. And we see that 8 have a scheduler but no planning function, and 17% with no planning and scheduling. And that's a huge opportunity, because what we find is that there's a huge savings, both in dollars and the efficiency of the work, by having the planner schedulers. Whoops. So I'll also share this little tidbit with you as well. The planner's toolkit, it's changed. If you think about it, as a technician, you had this whole box of tools and you had all this great stuff. Really, for planning and scheduling, there's things like a digital camera, a tape measure, a sketch pad, a flashlight. An iPhone is a fantastic thing, or go out and take pictures and you bring that back to the desk and you plan the job. And so, just stuff to enable you to be able to do a better job of identifying what the tasks are, the parts, the materials to give that technician a head start. So when we talk about this, maybe you're ready to take the next steps. Maybe you're not planning and scheduling or getting the effectiveness. The planning and scheduling function is underperforming. You're in that 10% bucket that we talked about before. I really encourage you to consider our maintenance planning and scheduling training. We've got a 3-day course coming up, not too much in the future. The link is down here, the bit.ly/maintenance planning and scheduling, MPS_training. Really encourage you to think about that. It's a fantastic course, 3 days, we step all the way through all the parts and pieces of planning and scheduling. We get in some components of storeroom as well a little bit. We talk about the whole building the business processes, the CMMS. So very, very value added. And many organizations, what they'll do is they bring this course on site. And the reason is rather than just sending a few people, a whole lot of people get to hear the message. And when a lot of people get to hear the message, then you actually start to change behaviors a lot more effectively. So if you've got more than about 6 to 7 people, then it's really beneficial to bring it on site. But if not, send them to a public class that we list here, and it's a great way for them to learn and come back and be able to help you get to the next steps regarding planning and scheduling. And it's really important, as we identified here, the roles and responsibilities are a huge piece of that. And again, I would really encourage you to send not just a planner, but the supervisors. I was recently doing one at the University of Tennessee this past summer. We had a couple of technicians that were there, a couple of planner schedulers there, and they're like, Jeff, everybody should have heard this message that I've heard across the last 3 days. Now I've got to go back and I've got to try to implement this, and these guys haven't heard the message. And so that's why it's really valuable to bring it on site, or like I say, send as many as you can to a public class. All right. So at this point, Kim, we'll take questions. So if you got the chat box open, you can send a chat if you like. We'll take any questions that you have.
I've got a couple so far. What metrics should I track as a planner schedule?
Okay, from a planning and scheduling standpoint, I really look for a basic 3. The first one is PM compliance, and the reason with regard to PM compliance is simply, I want to understand, we put this work on the schedule, did we do it from a preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance standpoint? The whole goal there is we're trying to prevent future failures. I should really say it this way: we're trying to reduce, eliminate, or mitigate the consequences of future failures. And that's the whole point of having a PM program. So if we don't have that, if we're not doing it well, if our PM tasks don't add value, then what happens is we tend to be really reactive. And so, if we've got a high PM compliance, and yet we're still having a lot of failures, then that points to maybe you need to get people into the RCM2 introductory class so they can understand how equipment fails and how to better write those tasks, because simply, the PM program's not doing what you expect. And I'll share with you too, what we found from RCM2 analysis is that as much as 40 to 60% of the PM tasks don't address any of the likely failure modes of the asset. And so most of you could use more technicians, but yet if you go think about it, you're sending these technicians out and they're doing work, 40 to 6% of the work on the PM that adds no value. So we're wasting all this labor. So it's really important you get your PMs right. PM compliance would be the first metric I would look at. The next one would be schedule compliance. And schedule compliance is we put this on the schedule and we lock the schedule on this Friday, for example, and the schedule's for next week. Now, what did we do? So I don't want you adding things during the course of the week and then calculating the schedule compliance on that. That's not right. Once we lock the schedule on this Friday, next week, what did we do that we said we're going to do? That's what we're trying to measure. And we want to try to improve that over time. You might be at 40%. Okay, that's fine. How do we get to 60%? And we look at schedule compliance, for example, when we start hitting 85 to 90%, then we can ratchet up. So maybe we only put, ideally we want to have a goal of 100% available labor on the schedule, but maybe we only start with 50% of the available labor. And when we start hitting that 85, 90% schedule compliance, then we start saying, okay, how do we get 60% of the available labor? Then 70% of the available labor. That's what we're trying to do. And then the third one is schedule breakers. So if I had a schedule and it was estimated out right, and I couldn't accomplish it because I had break-in work, emergency or urgent work that broke the schedule, then I want to understand why. It's okay to break the schedule, provided that we're breaking the schedule for higher priority work than what's on the schedule. So what I mean is that from a schedule breaker standpoint, if we're breaking the schedule for lower priority work, then we need to be having the conversations with those people that are putting those requests in, because that's not what it's about. We should always be working based on priority, not hysteria. Okay.
Okay, got another question. Our planner scheduler does not have craft skills. Is that an issue?
Well, what happens is that the goal that works out really well if you have separate planner schedulers and you take and that individual's a scheduler. But the struggle is that without the craft skills, they're going to have to spend more time with the technicians. It's not that it can't be learned, but the learning curve is much steeper because they don't have that foundation. And again, I'm not saying it can't be learned. It can. It just takes more time. That's the only issue.
Okay, got another one. Who is the preferred person to develop the PM tasks?
Ideally, it's the reliability engineer, if you have one, and the maintenance engineer. But really, if you think about it, the best way to probably do it is to have a meeting at some frequency, maybe every 2 weeks for an hour, and go through some of the PMs. And where I would start is where you're bleeding, where you're hemorrhaging money from a standpoint of equipment that's unreliable. And I would go and I would focus on those pieces of equipment and try to have meetings, and because you really want to have the operators who operate the equipment, the maintainers. You might even want to have the engineer involved in it if they're available to you. And that way you can look and say, okay, well, what have we seen in the past? Collect that. And the reason I mentioned doing that with a group of people is because you don't really typically have good data inside the CMMS to be able to record that. See, so you have to get the knowledge out of the individuals' heads who maintain and operate the assets.
Okay. What if our maintenance group is small and we can't afford a planner scheduler?
Well, what I would dedicate is what I would do is I would dedicate an individual maybe 4 hours a day or some smaller portion. And the reason is because if you can get somebody doing some level of planning and scheduling and trying to get parts together and working with those other technicians, it will actually, you will get more work done. And as an example, with Doc Palmer in Jacksonville Electric Authority, he talks about, says, when we had 30 technicians and they were at 35% wrench time, and when we got to, by planning and scheduling work, we changed that from 35 to 55% wrench time. And by the way, when we talk about best in class, it's somewhere in the 55 to 65% wrench time. But when they got to 55%, they realized basically the equivalent of 17 additional people over the 35% because they were now able to execute much more work. See, so they saw 17 additional bodies, a total of basically the equivalent of 47 technicians utilizing that same 30 simply because they were planning and scheduling. They were giving the technicians a head start.
Okay, if nobody has any more questions, then I believe that's it. Oh, we got
Okay.
one more, hang on. Where is the 55 to 65% wrench time best in class?
What is it? Wrench time is simply actually doing the work. It's not traveling to and from the job. It's not looking for parts. It's not hunting for information. What it's doing is actually turning the wrench, physically doing that job. Okay. Now, we typically, when we estimate a job, we have to put in travel time. That's a given, but that's really not wrench time. And, some organizations will include it. That's fine. But the point is, we're still trying to drive. How do we eliminate the obstacles that the technicians are facing? Again, looking for parts. We want to send all the parts with them. They may have to swing by the stockroom and pick it up because nobody's delivering it to them. But to swing by the stockroom, grab it, and then go on, and they've got everything they need in this box of parts that they need to execute the job. All the information is there. The job package is there that has the plans and other things like that. So again, we're trying to drive. Typically, most organizations are in the 25 to 35%, and I've seen as low as a 12% measured wrench time. And the goal is 55 to 65%.
Okay. What is the difference for shutdown and turnarounds?
Well, the difference is with shutdown and turnarounds, you have longer durations. And so you might be planning 3 months worth of work. For example, if you're a utility, you may take down a turbine set or something like that. And as part of that, the work is very detailed. And so if you take the normal planner who's dealing with the daily activities that go on as part of the maintenance function, they don't have time to do that and to optimize a shutdown turnaround schedule. Okay? So we really want, in many cases, a separate planner scheduler to execute that.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you again for joining Maintenance and Reliability Best Practices Online Training. We look forward to hosting you for another topic in the near future.
Thank you so much.